It's a time of discovery.
BBC Radio 1 and 1 Extra Stories.
Discover more.
There are many artists who claim to be independent and claim to be labelless, but I would argue it's a complete myth.
People tend to start at quite a young age, or having nothing to lose. The odds are so against you.
I don't think we turn over enough money on an annual basis to pay one of us a salary, something that we do because the music needs to be out there.
I suppose in an era of fake news, people want to believe in labels because they want to believe in something.
I'm Benji B. Welcome to Independent State of Mind, an hour-long celebration of the independent record labels shaping the music world.
I think the first thing to remember is it's all about the artists, and the artists create the future.
One man's trash is another man's gold. That release could have been a real gamble for me.
The greatest people who have run independent labels tend to be mavericks.
Over the next hour, I'm going to be celebrating independent music labels, the influencers, pioneers and grafters who put in their hard work and money day in, day out to produce the best new music.
I think we can say it, we're the guys that have set out a lot of things which have followed us. All of a sudden we found ourselves headlining festivals and charting in America.
The UK's independent music sector is the most successful in the world, responsible for discovering and developing many of the most popular and acclaimed musicians from our time. From global stars like James Blake and Adele, all the way through to leading lights in classical, electronica, jazz, metal, and absolutely everything in between.
The XX winning the Mercury. I think at the time I was so in my head thinking about the next thing and the next thing.
You know, sometimes I see running a label a little bit like running a football team. Every few years there's a transfer window and you try and strengthen your squad with the star strikers.
Over the years I've been privileged to meet and work with some of the best, and today we're going to be hearing from some of them direct, both from the UK and the US.
Every day is the possibility that it could end at any time.
Hearing your own music for the first time, really loud, with more bass than you could ever imagine at home, was definitely life-changing for me.
So before we get into it, what exactly is an independent record label? Well, indies release music from artists they sign up, and they do so without outside funding from other businesses or major record labels. As a general rule, they don't take anyone else's money, so they don't have to answer to anyone. And it's just about the artist they want to sign and the music they care about. And that's what makes them independent. But if you wanted to set one up, where'd you start?
I'm Robin Carolan and I run Triangle Records.
Triangle Records was founded by Robin Carolan in 2010 and has released critically acclaimed records from The Hacks and Cloak, Forest Swords, Holy Other and Clams Casino.
The idea for the label started in 2009. At that time, I was involved with a blog, which was pretty popular at the time, and it was kind of known for being a bit of a tastemaker site when blogs really seemed to have an influence on what was happening. It sort of fell into my lap somewhat.
I'm Martin Flynn from LuckyMe.
And I'm Dominic Flanagan from LuckyMe.
LuckyMe is a record label and design studio that was founded in Glasgow in 2007, while several of the members were still studying at Glasgow School of Art. LuckyMe was the first place we ever heard Hudson Mohawk, Lunis and Jacques Green.
I mean, as far as locally, there was other labels, but not doing sort of what represented what we were into.
When I started Planet E in 1991, I started it as a way to get my own creative freedom.
Planet E Communications is a label owned by the legendary Carl Craig that began recording in 1991 in Detroit, USA. And I think it's fair to say is the oldest label that we're featuring tonight. Planet E has grown consistently through a range of artists who experiment with sound and expand the genre of electronic music.
I've been fortunate because, again, it's an artist-based label, and it's about music that not only makes me move, but that goes to my idea of what I think good music is.
I'm Kevin, aka Pangier.
I'm David, I make music as Pearson Sound.
I'm Ben, I go by Ben UFO, and together we run the Hessle Audio record label.
Hessle Audio was founded in 2007.
We were all at university together in Leeds, and we were also running a radio show, and so we thought it would be a good opportunity to release some of the unreleased music that were being sent for the radio.
Hyperdub started as a web magazine 2001, covering some of the underexplored sides of, at the time, what was dark garage.
Hyperdub is one of my favourite London-based record labels, and it was founded and run by the artist Code 9. It's been going since 2004, and it was the first place that we ever discovered Burial, Iconica, Cooley G, Laurel Halo, Fatima Al Qadiri. It's also released music by Zombie and represented the footwork movement from Chicago very strong in the UK, releasing music by the late, great DJ Rashad.
I think a lot of the artists that I've signed, to my ears at least, they've had some kind of innovative role in their genre.
This is Caius Pawson from Young Turks Recordings.
Young Turks was launched by Caius Pawson in 2006 after his increasingly notorious and sometimes illegal parties were raided by police.
You see some labels, these labels are beautifully put together and seem to have a vision from the start. Young Turks was not that.
Originally an imprint of the amazing XL Recordings, they're an example of the sheer scale of what can be achieved by an independent label. Major signings include the XX, Subtract, FKA Twigs and Sampha.
I didn't really know what we were doing, so it was a more idea of signing acts that we liked and seeing how it went.
Don't think about it too much, too much, too much, too much. There's no need for us to rush this through. Don't think about it too much, too much, too much, too much. This is more than just a new lust for you. Feel like you're by my side, laying upside down. Clouds upon clouds, and you on my mind. Oh, I don't think about it too much, too much, too much, too much. And there's no need for us to rush this through. Don't think about it too much, too much, too much, too much. And this is more than just a new lust for you. Don't give up when your heart's done. And you tell me that you care, that you care. Don't give up when your heart's done. And you tell me something's gone wrong. Wholehearted, wholehearted, you care. I know you care about me. You care about me. I know you care about me. I know you do. Oh, I don't think about it too much, too much, too much, too much. There's no need for us to rush this through. Rush it through. I don't think about it too much, too much, too much. Yeah. There's no need for us to rush.
You just heard one of my favourite artists on one of my favourite labels, Sampha on Young Turks with Too Much. This is Benji B, and you're listening to Independent State of Mind, acknowledging the contribution of independent music. When you're running an independent label, the relationship with your artist is paramount. Here's Caius Pawson of Young Turks.
I think the first thing to remember is it's all about the artists, and the artists create the future. What you're allowing is an environment in which great artists can thrive. And that environment can just be the time and space to get things right. It can be influencing them in a certain way. It can be giving them opportunities. What we've made as a rule within Young Turks is you just always do what is right for the artist. Whatever is in their interest to keep them the happiest and for their career to have the best long-term success is what you do. For me, the label is involved early on in the crucial genesis of the project. There's an extremely passionate period of making records and then putting them out there. And that relationship is crucial to the success of an artist's career.
That creative period can be very intense. Triangle's Robin Carolan is a believer in pushing artists as far as they're willing to go.
I think generally when artists have joined Triangle, I've always been very involved in almost everything. At the same time, a lot of the artists that join Triangle are very new. You know, they haven't even made albums yet. So there's usually a process of, you know, them having to develop the sound or really figure out, you know, what they're about, what they're trying to achieve. And I think one thing that I have always done, for better or for worse, is push. It's not something all labels do. You know, I think the vast majority of labels actually kind of take their foot off the pedal and they kind of just let the artist go and do what they want and don't really have too much of an opinion about it, unless they really hate it and suddenly they don't want to release it. But I've always found that really hard to do. Like, you know, if I'm going to sign someone, then I'm going to be invested in lots of ways. Rabbit is someone that I pushed really hard, but it was just because I saw so much potential in what he was doing and I really wanted him to get to that point. I don't know, he just needed that. And, you know, looking back on that situation, we both talk about it and we both kind of agree that even though at times it was very stressful and probably not very fun for him, it was kind of worth it because, you know, he ended up making a really great album that got talked about. But I'm always kind of pushing, you know, in some way or another. It just depends on the situation.
Although the relationship with artists is crucial, it's also important that you understand when to let go. When what you can offer your artist no longer works for them, or if they've simply outgrown you.
I think an interesting example about what we do differently with LuckyMe is that it's never been about exclusively holding the rights of our friends' music. It was very much about the promotion of our sound and promotion of our peer group. Very early, that meant that my role specifically was like actually helping send out Hudson and Rusty demos very early, and it meant that they got signed to Warp. That was never an issue because it was never promised us that we would make a living out of this in Glasgow. And so for those guys to sign, it was a no-brainer. There was no difficult conversation to be had about leaving LuckyMe. And I think because of that, it meant that they continue to talk about us and they continue to be associated to us.
We don't really see ourselves as being in competition with anybody either in particular, I don't think.
Ben UFO from Hessle Audio.
I've never been into the idea that we're kind of scrapping with other labels over what we might get to release.
Pearson Sound.
We've never really had any heavy-handed contracts saying to artists that they have to work with us for years and years and signing these, you know, crazy deals that you hear happen to some young producers. We've never been into locking people down exclusively for long periods of time because we want the artists to want to work with us as well as us working with them.
I guess, for example, when it came for James Blake to start making albums and to go down the path that he's gone, it wouldn't have made sense to do it with us. It just needed to be with a bigger outfit that could do that project justice.
People, to get in the game, I think they have to be a lot smarter and a lot more collaborative and a lot more open. I think that's always been a plus for us to be non-exclusive. You know, we put out 2 or 3 Machine Drum records and then he went on to sign with Ninja Tune. That was the right decision for him at that time. That's where his music was going and that's what he had to do next. And again, he's only grown and that catalogue has only grown for us. I don't see the problem. And, you know, even as that relationship continues, we stay involved in the artwork for those labels, and if you're looking for it, you'll find a LuckyMe eye on those records. That's what this is. It's like a tribal thing. This isn't about intellectual property.
One of Young Turks' biggest signings is undoubtedly the XX, and Kais has had quite an unconventional approach to working with them, but one that's clearly been very successful.
Before I met the XX, I'd had a few experiences which were crucial to sort of development of my thinking about how to work with acts. I'd relied way too much on old industry norms of signing a record deal, paying for an album, putting it out and seeing how it went. And I was a bit burnt by some things that hadn't gone as well. That's when I met the three of them, and actually at the time it was Oliver, Romy and Baria. It was before Jamie had joined. I was very keen to do things in a much slower and more considered, but also freer manner. So without managing them, I helped them find rehearsal spaces, helped them find gigs, and I just let them go at a very slow pace. I was not interested in signing a record deal that was going to put pressure on these teenagers. And I needed a bit of a break, to be honest, so I needed to let it breathe. What then ended up happening was over 2.5, 3 years, via the rehearsal space and being able to play more shows, and then we built them a studio, we made the album. And once that picked up momentum, going into the album release, we decided it was time to do a record contract. In that period, I'd ended up managing them because nobody else had wanted to manage them. And we had a quite good relationship, and we ended up signing the record deal 3 months after the record came out.
They say we're in danger, but I disagree. If proven wrong, shame on me, but you've had faith in me, so I won't shy away. Should it all fall down, your love been my favorite mistake. They say you are dangerous, but I don't care. I'm going to pretend that I'm not scared. If this only ends in tears, then I won't say goodbye. Cause I couldn't care less if they call us reckless until they are breathless. They must be blind. There are voices raining over. They keep saying danger, danger. I can't make them take you under. Makes no difference. No one can take this away. Should it all fall down, I'll treasure each day. They say you are dangerous, but I don't care. I'm going to pretend that I'm not scared. If this only ends in tears, then I won't say goodbye. Cause I couldn't.
You just heard the track Dangerous by the XX, produced by Jamie and taken from their most recent album, released on Caius Pawson's Young Turks label. I'm Benji B, celebrating independent music labels, the influencers, pioneers and grafters who put in their hard work and money day in, day out to produce the best new music. The way music has been sold and distributed has changed a lot over the last 15 years. The decline of physical sales of CDs and vinyl, and the arrival of free sharing and illegal downloading of music online that took place, led to a point where many labels no longer really knew how to make a living from it. Now that a streaming model of buying music seems to be the main source of income, is it even possible to make a living as an indie nowadays?
I think it was in the early days of the label that everything felt a bit more risky just because we didn't have hundreds of pounds to lose at the time. Our first record was funded by our student loans. We couldn't put out the second record until the first record had sold out. These days, we're not working with enormous units, so the worst that could happen now is that we end up with like 200 or 300 copies of dead stock, which obviously isn't ideal, but it's not going to destroy us either. So yeah, I'd say it felt more nerve-wracking in the early days.
Carl Craig from Planet E.
Making a label now, I think, is way easier in comparison to when I started, because it doesn't take as much to run a label now as it did, 25 years ago. You can work at the post office and have a label and not worry about raising money to put out a record, because you can do it all in your bedroom. You can put it up online, and you could just keep doing your thing. And then as your career, as people are paying attention to it, then you start getting gigs, and that makes it possible that you can go outside of the box. It's a slow process, but we don't have to worry about artist development or anything like that.
When Hyperdub was a magazine, Burial was sending us letters and CDs. Then the year, I think 2006, we did his first album. And again, it was a risk because that was their first album that we'd released. And again, we pressed up 500, and I suppose it just kept snowballing until the second album, 2007, Untrue, which again kept snowballing. And it, in a way, has provided the fuel on which the label has been running on since then.
The main reason that we managed to come from absolute obscurity and it not being viable to run a record label and somehow it working out is, I think, circumstantial and pure luck. For a start, there was some just latent interest in what we do because of how good Hudson Mohawk's music was. So if I had to turn this into any tangible advice, I'd say sign someone who's excellent. It's the best thing that you could do. It makes everything much easier.
Outsourcing distribution, getting a P&D deal, which stands for pressing and distribution, has usually been the moment when becoming a label actually gets real. Dominic Flanagan of LuckyMe.
Generally, every record label makes their own distribution deal because you can't do that yourself. The bread and butter of the label very early in terms of the format of music that we sell was vinyl. That came at the time through Jackmaster directly suggesting to us that we put out the first Hudson Mohawk records on vinyl. He offered us what's called a P&D deal, underwritten by Hyperdub, which meant that we didn't have to put our hand in our pockets because we didn't have any money. There's no rich relatives behind LuckyMe, it's us. We didn't have to front the money to make the records. And then for every record that they sold, through the distribution of the record, they took a percentage on top of it. So it meant there was no initial outlay, but it meant we were definitely paying it back. I don't think anyone can make any good creative decision if they spend their life on the phone chasing up the CDs or vinyl they sold to shops.
Taking creative risks is at the heart of what independent labels do, alongside challenging the idea of genre, breaking them down and creating new ones. All of this is a vital part of making and releasing new music. Code 9 of Hyperdub is a renowned artist and DJ who has spent his career pushing music forward and really challenging the idea of musical genre.
I've always seen what Hyperdub is musically as strung somewhere between, hip-hop and dub and dancehall on the one side and house and techno on the other. And most of the music that we've released occupies some space in the middle. And it's not that I see on the one side hip-hop and the other side electronic music, because hip-hop has always been electronic music. I don't see an opposition there. I just see most of the music we've released as attempting to bring together what kind of is two cultures. The house and techno world and the world that's more influenced by hip-hop.
Many of these pioneering discoveries are made by accident.
So we put out a record by Tonight, which is Lunas and Hudson Mohawk.
Dominic Flanagan of LuckyMe.
Lunas would be staying at our house, eating £3 curries from the corner shop and sleeping on our sofa, and over a couple of days we made this record. It was them trying to make rap beats, and at the time I guess we had been associated with loads of electronic music and a different palette, and trying to kind of complicate and make the rhythm in our music more weird and club focused. This one was very much, no, let's make it more simple, let's try and make it more minimal, more impactful. And it was fun. Made the record in so little time, and it was just amazing to watch them. And then somewhat accidentally this kind of caught this wave where ultimately it went on to sort of catch a EDM scene that was blowing up in America, and all of a sudden we found ourselves sort of headlining festivals and playing stages at Coachella and charting in America and being noticed by all the major label hip-hop stuff that we once aspired to. I think the record has changed how hip-hop shows are performed live, in the way that like the context of like hip-hop guys side of stage watching us play on electronic music festivals. And I think it's definitely made some terrible music on SoundCloud, but we claim no ownership of that. I think it's amazing. I think that's how the internet works, is like these things will appear and then eat themselves.
One of the first records I put out was actually a Lindsay Lohan tribute tape, as bizarre as that sounds.
Triangle Records founder Robin Carolan also thrives on risk.
Effectively, I had a bunch of producers, underground artists, friends of mine, do covers of Lindsay Lohan pop songs, which are a very real thing. They do exist. That could have been a real gamble. It could have been one way to tank the label before it even got started, because, you know, when you kind of say it out loud, it does sound somewhat ludicrous. It's funny because now, 7-8 years later, I think you'd be hard pushed to find one indie or experimental artist who doesn't cite, you know, someone like Rihanna or artists like Sugar Babes. So there has been a real shift, and I think in some ways that's maybe something Triangle has at least played a part in making happen.
The idea of the scene is central to the development of a lot of music, but many indie labels have a sort of ambiguous relationship with the scenes they create, or the ones that create them.
Scenes are completely vital to the history of popular music as we know it, but at the same time, they're not everything.
Caius Pawson of Young Turks.
What scenes do is they create very fertile grounds from which artists are to be born. Bob Dylan might have come up in a Greenwich Village folk scene and then completely transcended it. Dizzy did it with grime, Prodigy did it with rave, the Beatles with beat music, Mersey beat in the 60s. Scenes are vital, but at the same time the best artists break out of them.
Dominic Flanagan of LuckyMe.
We definitely were part of a scene in Glasgow and then made a conscious decision to move away from it. Like, I moved to London. You're constantly having to like burn it all down and salt the earth and start again and like a new thing, I think. But we've always been rewarded for that, because then we started to make a buzz in the States in particular. You kind of have to move on. You have to keep moving on, otherwise you just date. You look at anyone who like shouted about one genre for too long. Where are they? They're gone.
Code 9 from Hyperdub.
I would say most of the music that I've been excited by in terms of dance music in the last 20 years has come out of scenes. It's come out of the core of scenes. It's not come from people trying to fuse or deconstruct or blur the boundaries of scenes. But at the same time, for a label and for an artist, scenes can become suffocating. Scenes, like any organism, have a lifespan. I mean, one thing that people argue about the internet is that it's eroded local scenes, and the idea that we will never have a big new style of music because things evolve so fast. Now, a new style goes online and already the clones are operating and it becomes copied, and the speed in which things evolve takes something away from growing slowly.
That was Higher Ground by Tonight, otherwise known as Hudson Mohawk and Lunis on the LuckyMe record label. By their own admission, a project that they didn't really expect to go very far and ended up in the US Billboard chart and influencing artists all over the world. It seems obvious to say that, like all types of communication, the way that labels talk with their fans, as well as the whole means of distributing music, has been completely revolutionised by the internet. But this can be a double-edged sword, as Dom from LuckyMe explains.
I think a difficulty would be that because the natural place for a young musician or a young record label to start is on the internet and on socials, that one difficulty we face is that, yes, it's this very populated place, it's very competitive, and as you start to build an audience in there, we've seen the record labels move platforms, and different things have been important at different times, and so you find that you're spending a lot of your time propagating the internet with content that you don't own. It's a gift and a curse, the internet, I think. There's a lot of work inherent in that model.
The opportunity to bombard your listeners with non-stop sales pitches is not the approach favoured by all labels. Sometimes it's really good to keep an air of mystery, as Robin Carolan and the guys from Hessle explain.
Social media is super important. It's how artists and labels communicate, especially as, magazines have started to go under in the last few years. Press coverage is becoming trickier. It's like a way of kind of controlling your own press, your own story in some ways. But I'm not personally a fan of social media. I think, again, it just goes back to this idea of like oversharing. I think the sense of mystique that started up with the label was, it was part strategy, but it was also just part, it was accidental. It was something that kind of needed to happen. I think just because myself and a lot of the artists that started up with Triangle just didn't really want to talk. They didn't feel comfortable doing interviews, photo shoots. They wanted to kind of be somewhat hidden. It wasn't necessarily this pretentious statement being made. Some people are just more comfortable talking about what they do than others. But then I think there was also an element of strategy. I think the less you know about someone, the more you tend to obsess over them. Because it's like any mystery. You feel like you want to solve it, or there's some kind of entertainment value in deciphering clues, constantly sort of chasing for an answer. There's a reason why people are so obsessed with Beyonce, for example, because she gives nothing away. But then I think it's a thin line. I think, it can also cross into slightly pretentious territory if you're not careful. You have to do everything on instinct, so hopefully you have the instinct to know when to call it, when to maybe give something away, and when to hold back.
I almost feel that we rely on other people to transmit our messages. We just want the music to do the talking. I think if we say that we've got a record coming out by someone, other outlets will pick up on it, and then people can make their own decision, I think.
At the same time, we do radio, we play in clubs, and that's a transmission of the message as much as anything else as well, I think. I think there's the local stuff, which is like playing in clubs, like the stuff that's in the moment. But all of our radio shows are archived. People around the world are listening every week and can download them as podcasts too. That definitely has an impact again on the music that we get sent, the music that we're playing. Like, we use Facebook and Twitter and all that kind of stuff as well. But it's definitely secondary to the actual playing out of the music as far as I'm concerned.
In the very early days of the label, we were even selling the records in and outside of the club, going out an hour before the night finished and waiting for people to come past to buy them, which I guess is maybe a very primitive version of Bandcamp or something. Now we've got our Bandcamp page, which feels, I think for everyone, feels like a much more direct interaction with the label and the fans. You can see who's buying your records. They get it shipped directly from us. They sometimes get it earlier than in actual shops. Tools like that are very useful for just having a nicer relationship with the people who are supporting your label.
I think it's good to have that kind of direct connection with people too in an era where it sometimes feels as though that connection is being kind of wrestled away from us a bit in favour of sort of the big conglomerate companies.
It was Hessle Audio that introduced me to James Blake. It was certainly the first time I'd ever heard of him when I got this track, Buzzard and Kestrel, on the Bell Sketch EP on Hessle Audio. This is Benji B. Tonight I'm taking a look at what it takes to run an independent record label. So if you're pioneering music to dance to, it's really good to have the opportunity to test your tunes out on a crowd. Dominic Flanagan and Martin Flynn of LuckyMe.
Running a club night was a really indulgent and great thing, and it's really valid, and it just means you're testing stuff in public and you've got a place to play your demos, and it just gives you a ton of confidence, I think. We ran nights from very early, and it's how we met a lot of the artists that we signed. Everyone that played was associated to LuckyMe in some way, and I would do the flyers and stuff. And this was a place, literally a basement bar, 50 cap or 100 cap, depending on where we used, with international guests. At the time we were like booking people from LA, Amsterdam, Montreal. There was kind of like a sort of global network of all the beat scene stuff and electronic music, and even like squee and like Scandinavian acts and sort of electronica and techno acts playing alongside hip hop stuff, but in this tiny basement. It was just us doing our own thing and sort of incubating our own sound that really only we cared about at the time.
A lot of things at that time seemed to either be one genre, very straight up, straightforward, or the sort of what was coming in more open format wise. You could play all techno for half an hour and then drop straight into just playing like southern rap and just the weirder ends of it, just playing instrumentals, things like that. It's how you made that fit in between all these things. So these records became the standout parts of these club nights.
We were making these songs which were like transitional songs between different genres that you get stuck into, and it gave us our own thing. And somewhere like now, when you look at it like coming up on 10 years later, this has become a genre in its own right that people are imitating. But like for us, it was always about sort of transitioning between all the stuff that we loved. Rusty's record Zigzag is a good example of this sort of transitional song that was like specifically designed to segue between like hip hop and techno, I guess. It's a good example of Martin's point of like we were just making these things, thinking about it in a live context, thinking of them as tools for sets.
Here's the guys from Hessle Audio.
I think the DJing is almost like our A&R process in a way. It's like a kind of non-verbal way of doing A&R. Like, it's quite rare for us to have loads and loads of back and forth with the producers and artists that we're working with as to what we want the music to be, what we want it to do.
And even if we get a record mastered on the label, then, you know, the next weekend we can test out the masters and maybe make adjustments. There's this good bouncing off of ideas between our DJing and the label.
It's been helpful for some of the younger guys that we work with too, to be able to get things like mixed feedback from us and to be able to come to clubs where we're playing and hear their productions loud.
I think it's just really important to be able to have spaces where you can hear music really loud. That's, you know, a lot of people have problems with neighbours and they can't crank it when making music. They've got studios in their bedrooms, so they never get the chance to just hear something shaking your whole body. And, you know, when some of the younger people on the label starting out are able to have that experience, it's sort of really heartwarming, because for me, I would just remember when I was starting out what a difference that made to me.
The other benefit of hosting your own night is that it localises your sound. Hyperdub is a London-based label with an international outlook, as label founder Code 9 explains. But sometimes you have to pay attention to what's happening in your own backyard.
It's nice to reconnect with what we're doing locally as well, because, you know, as we grew from 2004 onwards, we signed artists in Japan, we signed artists from the States, Germany, and so on, South Africa. And sometimes it's easy to forget where it started. It's cyclical. Every few years, we kind of reconnect with what is exciting us locally, because that's the backbone of the label, that's the foundation of the label. You know, obviously it's easy these days to run a completely delocalized label where you just you communicate with people through the internet and sign people from everywhere. But I think what's important for us as a label is having that local connection, which is the kind of lifeblood of what we're doing.
You just heard music by Burial on Hyperdub recordings from his classic album Untrue. It was Shell of Light. So once the music is produced, mixed and mastered, you face a very modern dilemma. To put out vinyl or not? You could just put it out digitally, but lots of us are still wedded to this idea of the physical object, and vinyl is so closely associated with the idea of independent record labels. Robin Carolan.
For me, vinyl's always been super important to the label. It's funny because even though, you know, I'm sort of known for generally releasing quite forward-thinking music, I do have a very old-fashioned side to me, and it's probably one of the reasons why I still really love vinyl. I hate to say it, but I don't always feel like something properly exists unless it's on vinyl. It's not a correct thing to say. Like, I know it's not, but at least I'm being honest about that. It's just some nonsense, old-fashioned opinion of mine, but it is mine. I think, you know, a lot of artists, they also feel, you know, because they'll say this to me, when they have that piece of vinyl in their hands, it suddenly does feel real to them. So I think it's important and it still has its place.
It's unfortunate in an era of digital music that people still don't take seriously a release that just comes out in digital.
Code 9 from Hyperdub.
There's a kind of weird analog bias that people don't take as much notice if there's not a physical object that accompanies it. I mean, since we started as a label, we've always released on all the formats that were available to us. So we started with just vinyl, and then when we did the first album, we did CDs, so it's vinyl CDs, and we now do digital, we do streaming. We love our CDs and we love our records. The way they look is super important.
Saying that, vinyl has become really hard to make. You know, in the last few years, it's suddenly become a bit of a problem for a lot of labels because suddenly everyone's making it and there are still only so many factories that can produce this stuff. So they're basically inundated. It just means everything kind of gets put back. It delays your schedule. And it's, you know, it's expensive to make. And unfortunately, as much as people like to talk about the vinyl resurgence and how it's doing really well and, you know, it sells, it doesn't. Old records do, new records don't. You know, if you check the top 5 records that sold best at Record Store Day, they're all like 30 years old. New music is not doing well on vinyl. And it just means for labels, it's actually becoming more of a financial loss to make it. So it's a real, I don't know, it's a conundrum. I love making vinyl, but at some point you have to kind of look at the numbers and think, wow, this is almost unsustainable. I think, yeah, the thing that bothers me most is just when people try and say vinyl's doing really well. It's not. It's doing really well if you have David Bowie's back catalogue or if you have the Beatles' back catalogue. New music is going down on vinyl.
So whether you decide to press vinyl or not, we all know that it's important that your artists have a strong visual presence. Here's Dom from LuckyMe, a label with visual design at its heart.
The process of coming up with the visuals for our artists is really just comes from a conversation. You will find that different people have a different visual association to how their music should look, or even just the things that they're into. Synesthesia is when people mix their senses, and so a big example that's often used is that when people hear sound, they see colour. So being slightly synesthesiatic about how the music should look. You might speak to an artist and he might tell you that his music has to be portrayed with the colour blue. And you're sat with a little bit of objective distance where you go, actually, no one knows who you are. We have to think of like what the story is that we're telling about you and trying to communicate something perhaps bigger or trying to associate you in a particular way. But I think through these conversations you have with the guys, they trust you. It's not just some like marketing. It's not like an extra layer that feels very distant. It's just like we think about how we kind of make it feel bigger, I guess. The house identity for LuckyMe is that I was trained in such a way that I came to art school full of hip-hop references and skate references and just wanted to make that work, and definitely had that sort of trained out of me or became conscious of my own biases towards this stuff, and which by its nature that was all made by outsiders in New York, but I didn't have any direct association to that work. I just loved it. But I learned at art school that really this should be approached like you're writing a brief for these musicians and you coming up with very idiosyncratic work. My work is best when I make something which is right for them. So maybe you want this hip-hop record to feel like a punk record, then that obviously lends itself to different medium. And so we sort of pick and choose along the way, and I hope that means that we end up with quite varied work that feels designed, but you maybe can't tell who it is that's doing it. I think that would be a success for me, and it would be better for the musicians.
You just heard music by Hudson Mohawk, an artist that I definitely discovered through the LuckyMe record label. This is Benji B. Tonight I'm taking a look at what it takes to run an independent record label. The ecosystem of independent record labels is a complex web. From the big hitters like XL, who originally signed The Prodigy and Adele and Basement Jaxx, all the way through to smaller outfits run out of people's bedrooms. As Code 9 explains.
I'd say the indie sector is stratified. There's quite a few tiers to it. There's like the mega indie, which would be like XL, who have many high-selling artists. Then you have like super indies under that, which would be, I'd say, is like Warp, Ninja Tune, and so on, who also have lots of, decent-selling artists. Maybe not on the mass level of like Adele, maybe more in the cult level of like Aphex Twin and so on. But that facilitates that label to do all kinds of things and mop up the talent that's coming up from below and so on. And then I'd say there's a tier under that we probably exist in. And then there's a tier under that is like most indies. I think a lot of independent labels, if they're lucky, have one, at least one artist who sells much better than the others and provides some kind of backbone for the label and allows the label to take risks and allows some releases to make a loss.
I think indies now have had to find ways, other ways to make their money. I do sometimes wonder if there could ever really be another major indie to emerge from all these labels that have emerged in the last 10 years. I'm not so sure. I don't think the industry is there to support it anymore. And I think it's just purely down to record sales, to be completely honest.
I don't think the answer is, we don't have to abandon the entire model, because for every successful act since I'd say the 1950s, it's been about touring, and it's been about, to an extent, an aggregated income. It's been about the act and how much the act wants to hustle to make its living. The record label there is basically, it's just staff working as agents for that artist. If that artist wants to make a living, there's definitely one to be made.
When I set up a label, vinyl's completely vital. Otherwise, you weren't really record label. Digital or CDs and physical was still the main format. Now, you could get a TuneCore account and put all of your music up on digital services instantly at very little cost. And you can make promotional videos for free and put them up on YouTube. So that is a lot easier. However, artists can just do that on their own now. So there are less barriers for artists to do things by themselves, and therefore small independent labels are not only competing with other labels, but they have to bring something of added value. I still think there's a place for record labels. Where record labels can prove that they're the necessary team for an artist, record labels will thrive. If you can get that far, you might end up having super indie. Will it look different? Definitely.
You apply pressure to help me crystallize, and you've got the faith that I could bring paradise.
I'll forgive and forget before I'm paralyzed. Do I have to keep up the pace to keep you satisfied?
Things have gotten closer to the sun, and I've done things in small doses. So don't think that I'm pushing you away when you're the one that I've kept closest.
It's still possible to make a living, and some labels continue to grow, but the idea of major growth and profits doesn't necessarily appeal to everyone.
I think we made a fairly conscious decision not to scale it up to anything else, because I think we like running a label in that way. I think a lot of labels, after a few years, if they're doing well, they get to a point where they could start thinking about ways to grow their operation, whether or not they want to start spending more money on press or employ other people to start working for them full-time or part-time. But then you're in a position where suddenly you have like people to pay on like month by month. You need to be turning over a certain amount of money, and that means, I guess, maybe that you're not in as much creative control as you were before. You might have to take some decisions that you might not have taken before. And I don't know, speaking personally, I've never really wanted that from Hessle. I mean, it's not exactly a professional operation. I don't think we turn over enough money on an annual basis to pay one of us a salary, right? It's something that we do because the music needs to be out there, and we're lucky enough to be in a position to DJ and do other things to earn the bulk of what we earn each year.
The old model of the major labels at the top of the hierarchy is something to aspire to seems to me pretty dated. And I suppose what you have now is a few different options, none of which are necessarily give you any more independence than the old major label model, but they're different and they're emergent models, whether it be the patronage of Red Bull Music Academy providing an alternative to the major label model, or whether it be artists supposedly doing it for themselves through a platform like Bandcamp. I mean, every era of music is deeply embedded in the technologies of the time, and I don't know what true independence would mean if it's not using the tools available to reach their audience.
I've been so blown away and impressed by the people and labels we've spoken to. These are the kind of people that make our musical lives as rich as they are. So much of the time not doing it for money, not doing it for fame, not doing it for promo, but really just driven by the love and passion for music. And for that we have to say thank you. It's also fair to say that I couldn't have done my job on the radio or in the club without their help. Not to mention the amazing amount of music that has enriched me in my personal life as well. So respect. So here's to Young Turks, Hessle, LuckyMe, Hyperdub, Triangle, Planet E, and all the independent record labels around the world. Let's hope that music from outside the establishment continues to shake things up and push things forward long into the future. I'll leave the last word to Code 9.
Running a record label is an experiment. We don't really know what we're doing next. It's dictated to us by our artists, in a sense. You know, it's a joyride. We've stolen someone's car and we're going to drive around the city at high speed, and we might crash at some point, but it's going to be fun.